The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of Montana as Jake Thompson stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand. His weathered face bore the marks of 35 years under the harsh western sun, and his calloused hands told stories of countless days working the land. The Silver Creek Ranch had been his home for over a decade, but lately it felt more like a prison of solitude. Jake lived alone on the 3,000-acre spread, his only companions being his faithful dog Rex and the small herd of cattle he managed with the help of 2 part-time ranch hands. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the closest town, Copper Ridge, was a dusty 40-minute drive down a winding dirt road. Most folks his age had families, children running around their ranches, but Jake had chosen a different path, or perhaps the path had chosen him. His parents had left him the ranch when they passed 5 years ago. And since then, Jake had thrown himself into the work. He was known throughout the county as a man of few words, but strong character. When neighbors needed help during harsh winters or difficult calving seasons, Jake was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Yet when the work was done, he would return to his empty ranch house, where silence was his most constant companion. The ranch house itself was a modest 2-story structure built by his grandfather. In 1952, the wooden floors creaked with memory, and the walls held faded photographs of 3 generations of Thompson men. Jake often found himself staring at these pictures, wondering if he would be the last Thompson to call Silver Creek home. Without a family to pass it on to, the ranch felt like a legacy waiting to end. His daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Wake at 5, check the cattle, mend fences, tend to the horses in the small stable behind the house, and handle whatever maintenance the aging buildings required. The work was honest and fulfilling, but it left plenty of time for a man to think, perhaps too much time. Jake had grown comfortable with his solitude, or so he told himself, but deep down, he yearned for something more than the endless cycle of ranch work and lonely evenings. Rex, his German Shepherd mix, had been his most faithful companion for the past 7 years. The dog seemed to understand Jake's moods and would often sit quietly beside him on the porch during those long evening hours when the weight of isolation pressed heaviest. They had an understanding, man and dog, born of shared silence and mutual dependence. The ranch itself was beautiful in its rugged way. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched to the horizon, broken by occasional clusters of cottonwood trees that marked hidden creek beds. In spring, wildflowers painted the landscape in brilliant colors, and in winter, the snow created a pristine white canvas that seemed to stretch forever. It was the kind of place that could heal a man's soul or drive him to madness, depending on his frame of mind. Jake had always been good with animals. His horses, 3 sturdy quarter horses named Thunder, Storm, and Lightning, trusted him completely. He could calm a spooked calf with a gentle touch and had a way with the more stubborn members of his herd that amazed his ranch hands. Animals seemed to sense something in him, a kindness that he rarely showed to people, perhaps because people were more complicated than animals, or more likely to leave. The loneliness had become more pronounced lately. Winter was approaching, and with it would come long months when the roads might be impassable for days at a time. Jake would stock up on supplies and prepare for the isolation that winter brought to ranchers in this part of Montana. Some years, he might not see another human being for weeks at a time, save for his ranch hands, who would brave the weather when necessary. He had dated a few women over the years, but none had been willing to embrace the isolated ranch life city. Women found the solitude overwhelming, and local women seemed to want more than Jake felt he could offer. His heart had been broken once, badly, by a woman who had promised to love the ranch life, but left when the reality of winter isolation set in. Since then, he had built walls around his emotions as sturdy as the fences around his pastures. The Silver Creek Ranch was profitable enough. Jake ran about 200 head of cattle and sold his calves each fall to buyers from the big ranches closer to Billings. He also bred horses, though more as a passion project than a major source of income. The ranch hands, Ben and Charlie, were good men who had worked for his father before him. They understood Jake's need for solitude and respected his quiet nature. As Jake finished his morning coffee and prepared for another day of work. He had no idea that this day would be different from all the others. He had no way of knowing that before the sun set, his life would change in ways he could never have imagined. The routine that had defined his existence for so many years was about to be shattered by an act of courage that would reveal the true measure of his character. The wind picked up from the west, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and something else, something that made Rex lift his head and whine softly. Jake noticed the dog's unease, but attributed it to the changing weather. He had learned to read the signs of approaching storms in this country, but he had not yet learned to read the signs of approaching destiny, walking toward the stable to begin his daily rounds. Jake Thompson had no idea that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become the first chapter in an extraordinary story of sacrifice, love, and the mysterious ways that kindness can return to those who give it freely. The lonely cowboy was about to discover that sometimes, when you give everything, you have to save a life. Life finds a way to give everything back to you. The distressed whinnying reached Jake's ears just as he was checking the water troughs near the eastern pasture. The sound was different from the usual calls of his horses, carrying a note of panic that made his blood run cold. Rex heard it too, his ears perking up as he turned toward the sound with a low growl of concern. Jake dropped the tools he was carrying and began running toward the noise, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth. What he found when he crested the small hill overlooking Willow Creek made his heart sink. A magnificent wild Mustang mare, her coat the color of burnished copper, was trapped in the narrow ravine that bordered his property. She had somehow become wedged between two massive boulders that had shifted over the years, creating a natural prison. The mare's eyes were wide with terror, and foam flecked her muzzle as she struggled desperately against her rocky confines. Jake could see immediately that she had been trapped for some time. Her coat was slick with sweat, and her breathing was labored from exhaustion and fear. The positioning of the rocks meant that any sudden movement could crush her ribs or break her legs. She was a wild horse, probably part of the small herd that roamed the public lands adjacent to his ranch. He had seen them from a distance many times, admiring their freedom and grace as they moved across the landscape like living poetry. This particular mare was stunning, even in her distressed state. She stood about 15 hands high, with the sturdy build of a Mustang, but an elegance that suggested superior bloodline somewhere in her ancestry. Her mane fell in dark waves down her neck, and despite her fear, there was an intelligence in her dark eyes that spoke of a spirit too strong to be easily broken. She was probably the lead mare of her herd, Jake realized, which would explain why she had been exploring new territory and ended up in this deadly trap. The situation was complicated by the mare's wild nature. Unlike his domestic horses, she had no trust in humans and would see Jake as another threat rather than a potential rescuer. Any approach would likely cause her to panic further, potentially injuring herself more severely in her attempts to escape. Jake had dealt with trapped animals before, never one this large, and never one trapped so precariously. He spent several minutes studying the situation from different angles, his mind working through possible solutions. The boulders were far too heavy to move by hand, and any attempt to use his truck and chains risked causing a rock slide that could kill the mare instantly. The gap where she was wedged was just wide enough for her body, but too narrow for her to back out or turn around. Someone or something would have to get into that tight space with her to help guide her to freedom. The nearest veterinarian was Dr. Elizabeth Carter in Copper Ridge, but she specialized in small animals and would likely not have the equipment or expertise for a situation like this. The county's large animal vet was based 3 hours away in Helena, and Jake doubted the mare would survive that long in her current state. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and he could see signs that she was going into shock from exhaustion and terror. Jake's ranch hands, Ben and Charlie, were working the north pasture that day and wouldn't be back until evening. Even if he could reach them by radio, there wasn't much they could do that he couldn't do himself. This was a situation that called for quick thinking and individual action, not a committee approach. The mare's life hung in the balance, and every minute of delay decreased her chances of survival. As he watched the magnificent animal struggle, Jake felt a connection he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was seeing a fellow creature trapped by circumstances beyond its control. Or maybe it was recognizing the fear in her eyes that mirrored his own fear of a different kind of entrapment. Whatever the reason, he knew he couldn't walk away and let her die. This horse represented everything wild and free that he had lost in his own life, and he would not let that spirit be crushed by unfeeling stone. The plan that formed in Jake's mind was desperate and dangerous. The only way to free the mare would be for someone to squeeze into the narrow space with her and help guide her movements while somehow creating more room for her to maneuver. It would require getting close enough to touch her, risking being kicked or trampled by a panicked 1,200-pound animal. More dangerously, it would mean positioning himself between the mare and the rock walls, where any sudden movement could crush him. Jake went back to his truck and gathered rope, his toolbox, and a small hydraulic jack that he used for truck repairs. The jack was designed to lift vehicles, but he thought it might be powerful enough to create a few crucial inches of space between the rocks. He also grabbed a heavy tarp and some grain, thinking the familiar smell of food might help calm the mare slightly. Returning to the ravine, he could see that the mare's condition was deteriorating. Her struggles had become weaker and her head was hanging lower. Time was running out. Jake took a deep breath and began his descent into the narrow ravine, speaking in low, soothing tones to the trapped animal. The mare's ears flicked toward his voice, and her eyes tracked his movement. But she didn't have the energy left for the panicked thrashing he had expected. As he got closer, Jake could see the full extent of her predicament. The rocks had shifted to create a V-shaped trap that was wider at the bottom than at the top. The mare had probably fallen into the gap and then become wedged as she tried to climb out. Her front legs had purchased on a narrow ledge, but her hindquarters were suspended in the gap. Held up only by the pressure of the rock walls against her sides, Jake positioned his jack against the most promising point where the rocks came together and began slowly applying pressure. The hydraulic system groaned under the enormous weight, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the gap began to widen. The mare felt the change immediately and tried to surge upward, but Jake spoke sharply too. His voice carrying an authority that seemed to penetrate her panic. What happened next would change everything. As Jake worked to create more space, one of the rocks shifted unexpectedly, pinning his left arm against the stone wall with crushing force. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but Jake realized with crystal clarity that if he pulled his arm free now, the rock would snap back and likely kill the mare instantly. He was trapped as surely as she was, and now both their lives hung in the balance of his next decision. Pain shot through Jake's left arm like lightning, but he forced himself to think clearly despite the agony. The shifted boulder had pinned his arm from just below the elbow to his wrist, crushing it against the rough stone wall with tremendous pressure. He could feel bones grinding together, and warm blood began to seep from where sharp edges of rock cut into his flesh. But the worst part was not the pain. It was the realization of what his situation meant for both him and the mare. The boulder that trapped his arm was the same one that had been supporting the upper part of the mare's prison. If Jake pulled his arm free, the massive stone would shift back to its original position with crushing force, almost certainly killing the terrified horse instantly. But if he left his arm where it was, holding the rock in its current position, he would slowly bleed to death while the mare remained trapped. There seemed to be no solution that would save them both. Jake's mind raced through possibilities while his arm throbbed with each heartbeat. He could try to reach his cell phone with his right hand and call for help, but the nearest emergency services were over an hour away, assuming they could even locate him in this remote ravine. His ranch hands wouldn't return until evening, and by then it would be too late for both him and the mare. The hydraulic jack that had created this precarious balance was wedged beneath tons of stone and could not be moved without releasing the pressure that kept the gap open. The mare seemed to sense the change in the situation. Her breathing became less labored as the additional space allowed her to position herself more comfortably. Her intelligent eyes were fixed on Jake. Perhaps she could smell his blood or sense his distress. Something in her demeanor shifted. The wild panic that had characterized her struggles earlier was replaced by a strange calm, as if she understood that they were both trapped now and that their fates were somehow intertwined. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Jake grappled with the impossible choice before him. His arm was beginning to go numb from the pressure, which he knew was actually a bad sign rather than a relief. The crushing weight was cutting off circulation, and he could feel his fingers growing cold. This continued much longer. He would lose the arm to gangrene, even if he survived the immediate crisis. But the alternative was to sacrifice this magnificent creature, who had done nothing wrong except trust her instincts about where to seek water. As the minutes passed, Jake found himself talking to the mare in a low, steady voice. He told her about his ranch, about the loneliness that had consumed his life, about his parents and the legacy he had inherited. The sound of his voice seemed to calm her. She began to respond with soft nickering sounds that almost seemed like conversation. In this moment of shared crisis, a bond was forming between the wild horse and the isolated man that transcended the usual barriers between human and animal. The pain in Jake's arm was becoming unbearable. Waves of agony that made him dizzy and nauseous. He could feel his strength ebbing as blood loss took its toll. His vision began to blur at the edges, and he knew that he was running out of time to make a decision. Either he would have to pull his arm free and accept the mare's death, or he would have to find another solution quickly before he lost consciousness entirely. That's when Jake made the decision that would define the rest of his life. If there was no way to save them both, he would save the one who still had a chance at the wild, free life he had never been able to achieve. Using his pocket knife, which he could barely reach with his right hand, Jake began the agonizing process of cutting through the tendons and muscle of his own trapped arm. The pain was beyond description, but he forced himself to continue, knowing that this was the only way to free the mare while keeping the boulder from crushing her. The process took what felt like hours. It was probably only minutes. Jake's vision faded in and out as shock set in, but he kept working, driven by a determination stronger than pain or fear. Rex had followed his scent to the ravine and was now howling frantically from the rim above, his cries echoing across the empty landscape like a call for help that no one would hear. Finally, the one last terrible cut, Jake's arm was free from his body, though still pinned beneath the rock. Blood flowed freely from the traumatic amputation, and Jake knew he had only minutes before he would lose consciousness permanently. But the gap in the rocks remained open, held by the grisly anchor of his severed limb.
Oh.
The mare could now move. More freely and with careful maneuvering, she might be able to work her way out of the trap, using his remaining strength. Jake began encouraging the mare to move forward and up, his voice weak but persistent. She seemed to understand what he was asking of her, and began the careful process of extracting herself from the rocky prison. Her hooves found purchase on the stone walls, and inch by inch, she worked her way upward toward freedom. Jake watched through fading consciousness, feeling a strange peace despite the terrible price he had paid. The mare finally pulled herself free from the ravine, just as Jake collapsed onto the rocky floor. She stood at the edge of the gap, looking down at the man who had given everything to save her life. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jake saw something in her gaze that looked almost like understanding, even gratitude. Then she turned and disappeared into the landscape, free once again to run with the wind. Jake lay bleeding on the stones, his life ebbing away with each heartbeat. The sacrifice was complete, and he felt no regret. In saving the mare, he had done something meaningful with his lonely existence. He had chosen love over self-preservation, freedom over safety, and courage over fear. As consciousness faded, Jake Thompson smiled. Knowing that he had finally broken free from his own kind of prison, Rex's howls continued to echo across the empty hills, a mournful song for a master who had proven that even the loneliest soul could achieve greatness through an act of selfless love. Rex's desperate howling finally reached the ears of Ben Martinez, Jake's senior ranch hand, who had returned early from the north pasture when storm clouds began gathering on the horizon. The German shepherd's cries were unlike anything Ben had heard before, carrying a note of desperate urgency that made his blood run cold. Rex was standing at the edge of the ravine, his powerful voice echoing across the landscape in what sounded like a call for help. Ben quickly radioed Charlie Watson, his partner, who was bringing the truck back from checking fences. Within minutes, both men were at the ravine's edge, peering down into the narrow gap where they could barely make out Jake's motionless form on the rocky floor below. The sight that greeted them was like something from a nightmare. Their boss lay unconscious in a pool of blood, his left arm clearly severed at the elbow, while the massive boulder that had caused the tragedy still held the gruesome remains pinned against the stone wall. Without hesitation, Ben rappelled down into the ravine, using rope from his truck, while Charlie called for emergency medical assistance on his satellite phone. The nearest hospital was in Great Falls, over 2 hours away by ambulance. But Charlie also contacted the Flight for Life helicopter service that served the remote areas of Montana. Time was critical, and every second could mean the difference. Between life and death for Jake Thompson, Ben's first priority was stopping the massive blood loss. Using his belt as a tourniquet and strips torn from his shirt as pressure bandages, he managed to slow the bleeding from Jake's traumatic amputation. Jake was unconscious but still breathing, though his pulse was weak and thready from blood loss and shock. Ben had served as a medic in the Army before becoming a ranch hand, and his training kicked in automatically as he worked to stabilize his injured boss. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to the tight-knit nature of the ranching community. Word spread quickly through the network of neighboring ranches, and within an hour, a dozen experienced ranchers and their hands had arrived at Silver Creek with ropes, pulleys, and first aid equipment. These were men who understood that in the isolated reaches of Montana, neighbors depended on each other for survival, and they responded to Jake's crisis as if it were their own. Dr. Elizabeth Carter arrived from Copper Ridge with her veterinary equipment, which included surgical tools and medications that could help stabilize Jake until proper medical care arrived. Though she was a small animal vet, she had training in emergency medicine and was the closest thing to a doctor available in the immediate area. Under her guidance, the rescue team managed to extract Jake from the ravine without causing further injury to his damaged arm. The Flight for Life helicopter touched down in Jake's front pasture 45 minutes after Charlie's initial call, its rotors kicking up clouds of dust as the medical team rushed toward the patient. The paramedics were amazed that Jake was still alive, given the extent of his injuries and blood loss. His survival, they said, was due to the quick thinking and skilled first aid provided by Ben Martinez and the other ranchers who had responded to the emergency. As the helicopter lifted off carrying Jake told the trauma center in Great Falls, Ben and Charlie were left with the grim task of understanding what had happened in that ravine. The evidence told a story that was both horrifying and inspiring. The hydraulic jack wedged beneath the boulder, the blood spatter patterns, and the position of Jake's severed arm all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Jake had deliberately amputated his own arm to save a trapped animal. The mare's hoofprints in the soft earth around the ravine confirmed that a horse had indeed been trapped and subsequently freed. Ben, who had worked with Jake for 8 years, knew his boss's character well enough to piece together the sequence of events. Jake had risked everything to save a wild Mustang, and when faced with an impossible choice, he had chosen the horse's life over his own physical wholeness. News of Jake's sacrifice spread throughout the county and beyond as the helicopter carried him toward medical care. The story touched something deep in people's hearts, a recognition of heroism in its purest form. Here was a man who had given up part of himself to save a creature that could never thank him, never repay him, and would probably never even see him again. It was an act of compassion so profound that it challenged everyone who heard about it to examine their own capacity for selfless love. At the Great Falls Trauma Center, Jake underwent emergency surgery to clean and close his amputation site. The surgical team, led by Dr. Michael Harrison, worked for 6 hours to save what remained of Jake's arm and to address the massive blood and shock that had nearly killed him. The prognosis was guarded, but hopeful. Jake would live, though he would need months of recovery and rehabilitation to learn to function with one arm. Word of his condition was relayed back to Silver Creek Ranch, where Ben and Charlie had taken over the daily operations with the help of neighboring ranchers. The community response was overwhelming. Ranchers who barely knew Jake sent money to help with medical expenses, Women from churches throughout the county organized meal trains to ensure Ben and Charlie were fed while they managed the ranch. Local businesses donated supplies and equipment to keep Silver Creek running during Jake's absence. The story reached beyond the ranching community when a reporter from the Billings Gazette heard about Jake's sacrifice and drove to Silver Creek to investigate. The article she wrote, titled "Cowboy's Ultimate Sacrifice Saves Wild Horse," is picked up by news services across the country and eventually around the world. Jake Thompson, the lonely rancher who had sought only solitude, became a symbol of human compassion and courage that inspired people everywhere. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story was yet to unfold. As Jake lay unconscious in his hospital bed, fighting for his life, something extraordinary was happening back at Silver Creek Ranch. The mare he had saved had not disappeared into the wilderness as expected. Instead, she had returned to the area around his ranch and seemed to be waiting for something. Ben and Charlie reported seeing her grazing in the meadows near the house, always alert, always watching, as if she were standing guard over the place where her savior lived. She was not alone. Other horses had begun appearing around Silver Creek Ranch, wild mustangs that had never been seen so close to human habitation. They kept their distance, but remained in the area, creating a strange and beautiful tableau that no one could fully explain. It was as if the mare had somehow communicated Jake's act of sacrifice to her kind, and they had come to pay their respects to the man who had valued a horse's life above his own well-being. Jake's eyes opened slowly in the sterile white room of the Great Falls Medical Center, consciousness returning like a tide washing over familiar shores. The antiseptic smell filled his nostrils, and the steady beeping of monitors provided a rhythm to his awakening. For a moment, he couldn't remember where he was or why his left side felt so strange and empty. Then the memories came flooding back: the trapped mare, the crushing boulder, the agonizing decision to save her life at the cost of his own arm. Dr. Harrison appeared at his bedside, checking the various monitors and 4 lines that connected Jake to the medical equipment keeping him stable. The surgeon's expression was cautiously optimistic as he explained Jake's condition. The amputation had been traumatic but clean, and there were no signs of infection in the remaining portion of his arm. Jake would need extensive physical therapy and psychological counseling to adjust to life with one arm, but he was expected to make a full recovery otherwise. The news of Jake's awakening spread quickly through the network of friends and neighbors who had been following his condition. Ben Martinez was the first to arrive at the hospital, bringing with him Rex, who had been pining for his master since the accident. The reunion between man and dog was emotional, with Rex whimpering and gently placing his head on Jake's good arm as if understanding that his human was injured and needed comfort. Ben brought news from Silver Creek Ranch that seemed too incredible to believe. The mare Jake had saved had not only survived her ordeal, but had returned to the area around the ranch. More remarkably, she had brought others with her. Wild horses were gathering in unprecedented numbers in the meadows and hills surrounding Jake's property, creating a sight that had drawn visitors from hundreds of miles away to witness. At first, Jake thought Ben was exaggerating to lift his spirits. But as more visitors came to the hospital, each told the same amazing story. The horses were not just grazing randomly near the ranch. They seemed to be organized, almost purposeful in their presence. The mare Jake had saved appeared to be leading them, and local wildlife experts were baffled by the behavior they were observing. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a wildlife biologist from the University of Montana, had driven to Silver Creek to study the phenomenon. She reported that the horses were exhibiting behaviors she had never seen in wild mustangs before. They remained in family groups but seemed to defer to the copper-colored mare Jake had rescued. More puzzling still, they showed no fear of the ranch buildings or the humans working there, though they maintained a respectful distance. As Jake's strength returned over the following weeks, he received a constant stream of visitors. People came from all over Montana and beyond to meet the cowboy who had sacrificed his arm to save a wild horse. Children drew him pictures, schools named him an honorary hero, and animal rights organizations praised his compassion. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had spent most of his adult life in solitude. But Jake was gracious to everyone who made the journey to see him. Among his visitors was Emma Richardson, a physical therapist from Billings who specialized in helping amputees adjust to their new realities. Emma was unlike anyone Jake had ever met, with auburn hair, green eyes, and a spirit that seemed to radiate warmth and determination. She had volunteered to work with Jake pro bono after reading about his story in the newspaper, saying that anyone with such courage deserved the best care possible. Emma's approach to therapy was holistic, focusing not just on the physical challenges Jake would face, but on the emotional adjustment required to redefine his identity as a one-armed rancher. She taught him techniques for managing daily tasks, introduced him to prosthetic options that might help with ranch work, and most importantly, helped him see that his sacrifice had not diminished him, but had revealed the true strength of his character. Their therapy sessions often extended beyond the scheduled time, as Emma and Jake discovered they shared many interests and values. She had grown up on a small ranch in Wyoming before pursuing her education and career in the city, and she understood the pull of the land and the satisfaction of working with animals. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of ranch management to deeper philosophical discussions about the relationship between humans and nature. Meanwhile, back at Silver Creek Ranch, the gathering of wild horses continued to grow. What had started with a few dozen animals had swelled to over 200 Mustangs of all ages and colors. They had established what appeared to be a permanent presence in the area, grazing peacefully but remaining alert and organized. Ben and Charlie reported that the horses seemed to be taking care of the land, moving in patterns that prevented overgrazing and actually improving the grass. In some areas, the phenomenon attracted the attention of television news crews and documentary filmmakers who wanted to capture the extraordinary sight of hundreds of wild horses gathered in apparent homage to an injured cowboy. The story of Jake's sacrifice and the horse's response resonated with people around the world, becoming a symbol of the deep connections that could exist between humans and animals when approached with respect and compassion. Government officials from the Bureau of Land Management visited the ranch to assess the situation. Wild horse populations were typically managed through roundups and relocation. But the BLM representatives found themselves reluctant to disturb what appeared to be a natural and harmonious arrangement. The horses were not damaging the land or interfering with neighboring ranches, and their presence seemed to have actually improved the ecological health of the area. As Jake's hospital stay extended into his 6th week, he began to worry about the impact his absence was having on his ranch and his employees. Ben and Charlie assured him that everything was under control, but Jake could sense there was something they weren't telling him. The truth was that the presence of the horses had transformed Silver Creek Ranch into something unprecedented in the American West. Visitors came daily to see the wild horses, and many asked to meet the man who had inspired their gathering. Ben and Charlie had started giving informal tours to help manage the crowds, and people often left donations to help. With Jake's medical expenses and the ranch's operation, what had begun as a tragedy was evolving into something miraculous. A demonstration of the power of selfless love to create unexpected blessings. The day finally came when Dr. Harrison declared Jake ready for discharge. His physical condition had stabilized, and while he would need ongoing therapy and adjustment to his new limitations, he was medically cleared to return home. Emma had arranged to continue his therapy sessions at a clinic in Great Falls, which would require regular trips from the ranch but would allow Jake to resume his life at Silver Creek. As Jake prepared to leave the hospital, he felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about returning to his ranch. The place that had been his refuge and prison was now the center of an extraordinary phenomenon that he still couldn't quite believe. Part of him wondered if the horses would still be there when he returned, or if their presence had been exaggerated by well-meaning friends trying to lift his spirits during his recovery. The drive back to Silver Creek Ranch was both familiar and surreal for Jake. Emma had offered to drive him home in her SUV, while Ben followed behind with Rex in the ranch truck as they turned off the main highway onto the dirt road that led to Jake's property. Nothing could have prepared him for what awaited. The hills and meadows that surrounded his ranch were dotted with horses as far as the eye could see. sight so magnificent and impossible that Jake had to blink several times to convince himself it was real. They were everywhere, magnificent. Mustangs in every color, from coal black to pristine white, with bays, chestnuts, and pintos scattered throughout the landscape like living jewels. Mares grazed peacefully with their foals, while stallions stood sentinel on the higher ground, their heads raised proudly as they surveyed their temporary kingdom. The sight was so breathtaking that Emma pulled the vehicle to a stop so they could both absorb the full impact of what they were witnessing. In the center of it all, standing in the meadow closest to the ranch house, was the copper-colored mare Jake had saved. She raised her head as his vehicle approached, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Jake could swear he saw recognition in her gaze, perhaps even gratitude, though he knew such thoughts might be wishful thinking on his part. She was magnificent, her coat gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, showing no signs of the trauma she had endured in the rocky ravine weeks earlier. As Jake's SUV pulled into his driveway, something extraordinary happened. The mare began walking toward the house, and as she moved, other horses followed. Within minutes, Jake found himself surrounded by a semicircle of wild mustangs, watching him with alert but peaceful expressions. They maintained a respectful distance but were clearly acknowledging his presence in a way that defied everything experts knew about wild horse behavior. Ben and Charlie emerged from the ranch house with broad smiles on their weathered faces, followed by several visitors who had come to witness the phenomenon. Among them was Dr. Walsh, the wildlife biologist, who approached Jake with barely contained excitement. She explained that the horses had been waiting for his return, becoming more restless and alert over the past few days, as if they somehow knew he was coming home. Jake slowly climbed out of the vehicle, his movements careful and deliberate, as he adjusted to his new physical limitations. The horses watched his every move but showed no signs of fear or aggression. Rex bounded over to greet his master properly, his tail wagging furiously as he danced around Jake's legs. The copper mare took a few steps closer, close enough that Jake could see the intelligence and gentleness in her dark eyes. Emma stood beside Jake, her hand lightly touching his good arm, in a gesture of support and wonder. She had never seen anything like this gathering, and as a therapist who worked with trauma survivors, she understood the profound healing power of what was happening. Jake's sacrifice had not only saved one horse's life, it had somehow created a bridge between the wild world and the human world that had never existed before. Over the following days, Jake began to understand the full extent of how his life had changed. The horses had essentially claimed his ranch as neutral territory, a place where wild and domestic could coexist peacefully. Visitors came from around the world to witness the phenomenon, and Silver Creek Ranch became an unofficial wildlife sanctuary that attracted researchers, photographers, and nature lovers from every continent. The financial impact was immediate and positive. The steady stream of visitors meant constant donations to help with Jake's medical expenses and ranch operations. A foundation was established to study and preserve the unique relationship between Jake and the wild horses, ensuring that the phenomenon could continue without disrupting the delicate balance that had been achieved. More importantly for Jake, personally, the presence of the horses filled the void that had defined his existence for so many years. He was no longer the lonely cowboy working his ranch in isolation. He had become the guardian of something magical and unprecedented. Every morning he would step onto his porch and be greeted by the sight of hundreds of horses living freely on his land, a constant reminder of the power of compassionate action. His relationship with Emma deepened as she continued to help him adjust to life with one arm. She had taken a leave of absence from her practice in Billings to spend more time at Silver Creek, ostensibly to continue Jake's therapy, but increasingly because she had fallen in love with both the man and the extraordinary life he had created. Their romance bloomed slowly, built on mutual respect and shared wonder at the daily miracle surrounding them. The copper mare, whom Jake had begun calling Liberty, became a regular presence around the ranch house. She would often graze near the porch where Jake sat in the evenings, as if standing guard over the man who had saved her life. Sometimes she would approach close enough that Jake could almost touch her, though he never tried to impose human contact. On her wild nature, their relationship was built on mutual respect and the understanding that some bonds transcend the usual boundaries between species. As autumn arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, Jake realized that his sacrifice had given him everything he had never known he was missing. The loneliness that had consumed his life had been replaced by purpose and connection. The horses had brought not only their wild beauty to his land, but had attracted Emma. His love was healing wounds deeper than those left by his physical amputation. The ranch operations had evolved to accommodate the new reality. Jake learned to manage his cattle and domestic horses while respecting the space claimed by the wild herds. It required careful coordination and innovative techniques, but the result was a functioning ranch that also served as a sanctuary for creatures that had never before trusted humans enough to remain so close to civilization. Ben and Charlie had become unofficial tour guides and educators, helping visitors understand the importance of maintaining respectful distance from the wild horses while still appreciating their magnificence. The three men had developed systems that allowed the ranch to continue operating profitably while preserving the unique ecosystem that had developed around Jake's act of sacrifice. On a crisp October evening, as Jake sat on his porch watching Liberty graze in the golden light of sunset, Emma approached him with a smile that held secrets. She had been spending more time at the ranch than her own apartment, and Jake had been working up the courage to ask her to stay permanently. Before he could speak, she handed him a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple gold band, and Emma's eyes sparkled with mischief as she explained that she had decided not to wait for him to work up the nerve to propose. She had seen enough of his character during his recovery to know that she wanted to spend her life helping him care for both his ranch and the wild horses that had chosen to make it their home. Jake's acceptance was wordless but complete, expressed in a kiss that was witnessed by Liberty and approved with a soft whinny that seemed to carry the blessing of the entire wild herd. As night fell over Silver Creek Ranch, Jake Thompson no longer thought of himself as a lonely cowboy. He had become something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, a keeper of miracles, and a man whose capacity for love had literally moved mountains. The story of the lonely cowboy who gave his arm to save a horse had become the story of how love, freely given, creates more love than anyone could imagine. 300 horses surrounded his ranch not as visitors, but as family. Drawn by the recognition that here lived a human who understood that all life was precious and worth any sacrifice to preserve. In losing his arm, Jake had found his purpose. In saving one horse, he had been blessed with hundreds. In choosing compassion over self-preservation, he had discovered that the universe responds to love with abundance beyond imagination. Silver Creek Ranch had become proof that miracles still happened in the modern world, and that sometimes the most profound connections are forged not through words but through the simple act of caring. It's enough to give everything for another living being.